January 1944. The Italian winter had turned the mountains south of Rome into a frozen hell. Rain mixed with sleet fell constantly, turning the roads into rivers of mud and the foxholes into freezing pools of water. Inside a commandeered villa far behind the front lines, Lieutenant General Mark Clark stood before a large wall map. Clark was the commander of the U.S. Fifth Army. He was tall, handsome, and ambitious. He was a man who understood the value of publicity. He had photographers follow him everywhere. He posed for newsreels. He ensured that his name was always in the headlines back home. But on this cold January morning, Mark Clark was a frustrated man. He looked at the map and his eyes burned with a single obsession: Rome. The Eternal City was just 80 miles to the north. No general in history had captured Rome from the south since Belisarius 1500 years ago. Clark wanted to be the first. He wanted the glory. He wanted the parade. He wanted his name to be written in history books alongside Caesar and Hannibal. But there was a problem. Between Mark Clark and his prize stood the most formidable defensive barrier in Italy: the Gustav Line. The German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had turned the mountains into a fortress. Every peak was an observation post. Every valley was a kill zone. And right in the center of the line, blocking the entrance to the Liri Valley, was a river. On General Clark's map, it appeared as a thin, meandering blue line. It looked insignificant. It was labeled the Rapido River. To a man standing in a warm headquarters studying a two-dimensional piece of paper, the Rapido looked like a minor obstacle. It looked like a stream that could be crossed in a few hours. Clark traced his finger across the blue line. He believed that if his army could punch across this river, they would open the gate to the Liri Valley. From there, the road to Rome would be open. He saw it as a quick, sharp thrust. A simple tactical maneuver. He did not know that the map was lying to him. Or perhaps he simply chose not to see the truth. Because 10 miles away on the banks of that river, Major General Fred Walker was seeing a very different reality. General Walker was the commander of the 36th Infantry Division, the Texas Division. His men were tough, battle-hardened soldiers. They were Tea-Patchers, proud men who had fought their way up the Italian boot mile by bloody mile. Walker was not a man who fought wars from a villa. He fought from the front. And on this gray winter afternoon, he was walking the ground. He stood on the southern bank of the Rapido and looked across. What he saw made his blood run cold. The river was not the gentle stream shown on Clark's map. It was a monster. Fed by the winter rains and the mountain runoff, the Rapido was a raging torrent. The water was freezing cold, moving at a speed of 8 miles per hour. It was swollen and angry. But the water was not the only problem. The banks of the river were vertical cliffs of slick mud rising 10 feet straight up from the water. Walker knew that no soldier could climb those banks while carrying a rifle and a heavy pack. They would slide back down into the freezing current. And then there was the terrain on the other side. Walker raised his binoculars and scanned the far bank. It was a flat, open plain. A killing ground. And overlooking that plain were the heights of Monte Cassino. The ancient monastery sat on the mountain peak like the eye of God, looking down on everything below. And hidden in the rocks beneath the monastery were the Germans. Walker knew they were there. He could feel eyes watching him. He knew that the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division had spent months preparing this trap. They had cleared the brush to create fields of fire. They had sighted their machine guns on the river crossings. They had buried thousands of mines in the mud. The Rapido River was not a crossing point. It was a moat in front of a castle that was bristling with guns. Walker lowered his binoculars. He took out his notebook and wrote a grim assessment. He wrote that a frontal attack here was impossible. He wrote that it would be suicide. He went back to his command post and called headquarters. He tried to explain the reality. He tried to tell Clark that the map was wrong. He said the river is flooded. The banks are too steep. The Germans hold the high ground. If we send men across there, they will be slaughtered. But Mark Clark was not listening to warnings. He was listening to the clock. Clark was under immense pressure. In London and Washington, the Allied High Command was already planning the invasion of France. Operation Overlord. D-Day. Clark knew that once the invasion of France began, the world would forget about Italy. The cameras would leave. The glory would go to Eisenhower and Patton. Clark felt his window of opportunity closing. He needed to take Rome before the summer. He needed a victory now. He also had a rivalry to contend with. On the other side of the Italian front was the British Eighth Army commanded by General Oliver Leese but overshadowed by the legacy of Bernard Montgomery. Clark hated the idea of the British getting to Rome first. He viewed the war in Italy not as a joint Allied effort but as a race. And the Rapido River was the starting line. On January 16, Clark issued the order. The 36th Division was to launch a frontal assault across the Rapido River. They were to cross at night, establish a bridgehead, and open the Liri Valley for the armor to pass through. When General Walker received the order, he was stunned. He argued. He pleaded. He suggested flanking maneuvers. He suggested waiting for the river to recede. Clark dismissed him. He told Walker that the Germans were weak. He told him that the enemy was retreating. He claimed his intelligence reports showed the German lines were breaking. This was a lie, or at best a delusion. German prisoners captured the night before had confirmed that the defenses were fully manned and heavily armed. But Clark ignored the intelligence that did not fit his narrative. He looked at his map and he saw what he wanted to see. A thin blue line. A simple step on the ladder to glory. He told Walker that the attack would proceed as planned. He said the 36th Division will cross the Rapido. Walker returned to his men with a heavy heart. He looked at the young faces of the soldiers. Texans, farmers, ranch hands, boys from San Antonio and Dallas. They were cleaning their rifles, writing letters home, joking about the Italian mud. Walker knew that many of them were writing their last letters. He wrote in his diary that night. He wrote, "I expect this attack to be a failure. It is caused by the stupidity of the higher command who do not understand the situation on the ground." The stage was set for a disaster. It was a collision between two worlds. The world of the map where rivers are just blue ink and mountains are just contour lines. And the world of reality where rivers drown men and mountains rain death. General Mark Clark sat in his headquarters dreaming of Rome. General Fred Walker stood in the mud staring at the dark rushing water of the Rapido. And 5,000 American soldiers waited in the rain unaware that a single error on a map was about to cost them everything. The date was set. January 20th, 1944. The impossible line had been drawn. And now the Texas Division had to cross it. January 20th, 1944. 8 o'clock at night. The sun had set over the Liri Valley, plunging the world into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. A thick freezing fog had rolled in off the mountains, mixing with the smoke of artillery shells to blot out the moon and stars. Down in the mud of the valley floor thousands of men were moving. They were the soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division. The T-Patchers. They were divided into two main assault groups. The 141st Regiment was assigned to cross the river upstream to the north. The 143rd Regiment was assigned to the south. Their orders were simple. Carry the boats to the river. Paddle across. Secure the bridgehead. But nothing about this night would be simple. Before they even reached the water, the disaster began. The approach to the river was not a clear path. It was a swamp. The heavy winter rains had turned the fields leading to the Rapido into a quagmire of deep, sticky mud. The men were carrying huge assault boats. These were not light tactical craft. They were heavy wooden and rubber pontoon boats weighing over 400 pounds each. It took 16 men to carry one. Imagine the scene. 16 men struggling in pitch blackness, sinking up to their knees in freezing mud, trying to balance a 400-pound boat on their shoulders. They slipped. They fell. They cursed in whispers. And then the first mines exploded. The Germans had heavily mined the approaches to the river. They had planted bouncing Bettys and shoe mines in the mud. As the Americans stumbled forward in the dark, a boot would catch a tripwire. There would be a sharp click followed by a blinding flash and a scream. Men fell writhing in the mud, their legs shattered. But they could not stop. The officers urged them forward. Keep moving. Get to the river. By the time they reached the banks of the Rapido, the men were already exhausted. They were sweating inside their heavy winter coats, yet shivering from the damp cold. Their hearts were pounding. and then they saw the river. In the darkness, the Rapido did not look like the thin blue line on General Clark's map. It sounded like a freight train. The noise of the rushing water was deafening. The current was tearing past at a speed that looked impossible to navigate. General Walker's warning had been correct. The river was swollen with floodwater. It was angry, but the order was to go. At the crossing points, the engineers struggled to get the boats into the water. The mud on the banks was slick as ice. Men slid down the 10-foot drop, crashing into the freezing water before they were even ready. As the first boats were launched, the map error revealed itself in the most horrifying way possible. On the map, the Rapido was a gentle barrier. In reality, it was a hydraulic press. As soon as the boats hit the water, the current grabbed them, spun them around like toys. The soldiers paddling frantically couldn't fight the power of the water. Some boats were swept downstream, immediately disappearing into the darkness. Others capsized, instantly dumping 16 men into the freezing torrent. These men were weighed down with heavy winter gear, ammunition belts, grenades, and rifles. When they hit the water, they didn't float. They sank like stones. There were no screams from these men. The water choked them instantly. They were dragged under by the weight of their own equipment, drowning in the dark only a few feet from the shore. Those who managed to keep their boats upright faced a different nightmare. The current was so strong that the boats couldn't go straight across. They were pushed sideways, drifting hundreds of yards off course. When they finally crashed into the far bank, the men scrambled out, desperate to find cover. But there was no cover. The far bank was a vertical wall of mud. It was too steep to climb. Men dug their fingernails into the slime, trying to pull themselves up, but they just slid back down. They were trapped at the water's edge, sitting ducks in a shooting gallery. And that is when the Germans opened fire. The enemy had been waiting. They had been watching the whole time. The German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was one of the best units in the Wehrmacht. They were veterans. They knew exactly where the Americans would try to cross. They had pre-sighted their artillery and machine guns on the riverbanks. They didn't need to see the targets. They knew the coordinates. Suddenly the night was torn apart. From the heights of Monte Cassino and the village of Sant Angelo, a storm of steel descended on the river. The sound was distinct and terrifying. The rip of the MG-42 machine guns firing at 1,200 rounds per minute. The screech of the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, which the American soldiers called screaming memes. The river exploded. Shells landed directly in the water, sending geysers of freezing spray and shrapnel into the air. Boats that were halfway across were blown to splinters. Bodies were tossed into the air like ragdolls. The machine gun fire was so intense it looked like a solid line of tracer rounds cutting across the water. It skimmed the surface of the river, decapitating men who were trying to swim. On the southern crossing, the 143rd Regiment was being annihilated. One battalion managed to get a few boats across. But as soon as the men climbed out of the mud, they walked into a wall of mines and barbed wire. The Germans fired flares into the sky, turning the night into day. Under the ghastly white light of the flares, the Americans were exposed. They had nowhere to hide. The flat plain on the German side was a kill zone. A lieutenant from the Texas Division later described the scene. He said it was like trying to run through a meat grinder. We were being hit from the front, from the sides, and from above. There was no place to go but down into the mud. The communications broke down immediately. The radios had been soaked by the river water and were useless. The telephone wires ran across the river but were cut by artillery fire. General Walker, back in his command post, was blind. He could hear the roar of the battle. He could see the flashes of the explosions lighting up the fog. But he had no idea what was happening. He tried to call his regimental commanders. What is the situation? Are you across? The answers were fragmentary and panicked. Boats lost. Heavy casualties. Taking fire from all sides. Cannot advance. At the northern crossing, the 141st Regiment was suffering the same fate. They tried to build footbridges for the infantry. The engineers worked heroically, standing chest deep in the freezing water, trying to lash pontoons together while bullets zipped past their heads. But every time they got a bridge halfway across, a German mortar shell would land squarely on it, blowing the structure and the engineers apart. It was futile. It was madness. By midnight, the river Rapido was choked with debris. Broken boats, shattered crates, and the bodies of young American men floated downstream, bobbing in the current. Some men who had made it to the far side tried to swim back. They realized that staying on the German side was a death sentence. They stripped off their uniforms and plunged back into the ice-cold water. Most of them never made it. Those who stayed dug into the mud with their bare hands. They pressed their bodies into the freezing earth, praying that the next shell wouldn't find them. They could hear the German soldiers talking just a few yards away. They could hear the bolts of the machine guns clicking. Back at headquarters, General Mark Clark sat waiting for news of victory. He expected to hear that the bridgehead was secure. He expected to hear that the tanks were moving up. He was already thinking about the press release announcing the breakthrough to Rome. He did not know that his map error had just turned the Rapido River into a graveyard. He did not know that down in the valley the 36th Division was being systematically murdered. Around 4 in the morning, a silence began to fall over the river. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion. The first wave had been destroyed. The surviving officers on the ground pulled their men back. They retreated to the American side of the river, leaving their dead and wounded behind on the far bank. They huddled in their foxholes, shaking from cold and shock. They thought it was over. They thought that surely the generals would realize the mistake. Surely they wouldn't send anyone else into that hell. But as the sun began to rise over the smoking valley, the telephone rang in General Walker's command post. It was an order from General Clark. The attack had failed because of a lack of aggression, Clark said. The river must be crossed. Launch the second wave immediately. General Walker put down the phone. He looked at his staff officers. He looked at the shattered remnants of his division. He knew that he was about to give an order that was nothing short of an execution. The nightmare was not over. It was just beginning. January 21st, 1944. Dawn. The sun rose slowly over the Leary Valley, revealing the full horror of what had happened in the darkness. To the men of the 36th Division huddled in their foxholes on the near side of the Rapido, the river looked like a slaughterhouse. Broken boats lay smashed against the rocks. The bodies of their friends were tangled in the barbed wire or floating face down in the gray water. The mud was stained black with oil and red with blood. But the nightmare was about to get worse. Because out there on the other side of the river there were still men alive. During the chaotic night assault, a few hundred soldiers from the 141st and 143rd Regiments had actually made it across. They had clawed their way up the slippery banks and dug shallow holes in the mud of the German side. Now as the sun came up they were trapped. They were pinned down in a flat open field with the Rapido River behind them and the entire German army in front of them. They had no radio contact. Their walkie-talkies were soaked and dead. They had no food, no reinforcements, and most terrifying of all, they had no ammunition left. They lay flat in the freezing mud, pressing their faces into the dirt as German snipers picked them off one by one. Every time a soldier moved an inch, a bullet would strike. They were not fighting anymore. They were just waiting to die. Their only hope was a bridge. If the engineers could build a bridge across the river, tanks could come across to save them. Ambulances could come to take away the wounded. And so began one of the most tragic and heroic chapters of the battle. The struggle for the bridges. The combat engineers of the 36th Division were given an impossible task. They had to build Bailey bridges and pontoon crossings under direct observation from the German artillery observers on Monte Cassino. It was suicide work. The engineers ran out onto the exposed banks carrying heavy steel panels and wooden planks. They worked frantically, standing chest deep in the freezing current, their hands numb with cold. But the Germans were watching. High up in the monastery, the German spotters looked down through their high-powered binoculars. They saw every movement. They waited until the bridge was almost halfway across. They let the Americans do the hard work. And then they radioed the coordinates to the gun batteries. The air would fill with the shrieking sound of incoming shells. The water would erupt. One engineer lieutenant later described the scene. He said, "We would build for an hour and then in 5 seconds it would all be gone. The bridge would just disintegrate. Steel beams were twisted like pretzels. Men were blown into pieces. and then we would have to start all over again. It was a cycle of futility. Build, die, repeat. At one crossing point, the engineers managed to get a footbridge across. It was a flimsy structure just wide enough for a single man to walk on. Desperate to reinforce the trapped men on the other side, a platoon of infantry tried to run across. They sprinted one by one over the swaying planks. The German machine gunners held their fire. They waited until the bridge was full of men. Then they opened up. The MG-42s cut through the line of soldiers like a scythe cutting wheat. Men fell left and right, tumbling into the water. The bridge itself was sawed in half by the sheer volume of bullets. It collapsed, dumping the survivors into the raging current to be swept away. By mid-morning, the banks of the Rapido were piled high with the dead. The engineers had lost almost all their equipment. The rubber boats were all destroyed. The bridges were wreckage. General Walker, the division commander, walked among his men. He saw the 1,000-yard stare in their eyes. He saw tough combat veterans shaking uncontrollably. He knew that his division was broken. He went to the telephone to call Corps headquarters. He was certain that the attack would be called off. The evidence was right there in front of him. The river was impassable. The enemy was too strong. To continue would be murder. He expected to hear the order to withdraw, to bring the survivors back, to regroup. But the voice on the other end of the phone did not say withdraw. It was General Jeffrey Keyes, the Corps commander, relaying the orders from Mark Clark. The voice was cold and detached. It asked why the bridges were not ready. It asked why the tanks were not moving. Walker tried to explain. He listed the casualties. He described the murderous crossfire. He told them that the stream on their map was a death trap. The response from headquarters was an insult that would burn in the hearts of the Texas soldiers for generations. The attack failed because of a lack of aggression, the command said. The men are not pushing hard enough. You must attack again immediately. Lack of aggression. Walker looked at the bodies of his engineers floating in the river. He looked at the men who had charged into machine gun fire with nothing but rifles. He looked at the blood on the mud. He could not believe what he was hearing. The high command was blaming the soldiers. They were blaming the victims of their own incompetence. Mark Clark refused to believe the reports. In his mind, the map was right and the soldiers were wrong. He believed that the Germans were weak and that his men were simply failing to exploit the opportunity. He ordered a second attack. Not a flanking maneuver. Not a different strategy. But the exact same attack in the exact same place against the exact same machine guns. Do it again, Clark ordered. And this time do it in broad daylight. It is the definition of insanity. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. But in the military, insanity is often just an order. When the word came down to the regiments, the officers openly wept. Battalions' commanders threw their helmets on the ground in rage. Sergeants looked at their squads knowing they were about to lead them to their deaths. One colonel pleaded with General Walker. General, he said, please don't send them back. It's a massacre. Walker had tears in his eyes. He said, I have no choice. The order comes from the top. And so the preparations began for the second wave. The men checked their weapons. They didn't speak. There were no jokes now. No bravado. They knew what was waiting for them. They looked at the river, which was still rushing by, cold and indifferent. They looked at the far bank where the German guns were silent, waiting. They were about to walk into the fire for the second time. At 4 p.m. the whistles blew. The second assault began. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The smoke shells were fired to cover the advance, but the wind blew the smoke away, leaving the men exposed. As the fresh troops rushed towards the water carrying the last few remaining boats, the German artillery opened up with a ferocity that shook the earth. This time there was no surprise. The Germans knew they were coming. They had spent the morning resighting their guns. They had brought up more ammunition. The slaughter was instantaneous. Boats were blown up before they even touched the water. Entire squads were wiped out by single mortar shells. The river turned red with blood. But the Americans kept coming. Driven by duty. Driven by orders. Driven by the fear of letting their buddies down. They charged into the bridge of death. and General Mark Clark, miles away in his villa, waited for the news that he had conquered Rome. He did not know that he was destroying his own army. The sun began to set on the Rapido, and as darkness fell, the screams of the wounded were louder than the roar of the river. The second wave had failed. The tragedy was complete. But for the men trapped on the wrong side of the river, the horror was just beginning. They were now truly alone, abandoned in the dark with the enemy closing in. January 21st, 1944. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The winter sun was beginning to dip below the mountains, casting long shadows across the Liri Valley. But there was no peace in the valley. There was only a suffocating sense of dread. Inside the command tents of the 36th Division, a scene was playing out that was rare in the history of the United States Army. Battle-hardened officers, men who had led charges in Salerno and San Pietro, were openly weeping. They had just received the order from Corps headquarters. The order to go back in. Colonel William Martin, the commander of the 143rd Regiment, held the phone receiver in a shaking hand. He listened to the voice on the other end telling him to launch his battalions across the river again. Immediately, Martin looked through the tent flap. He could see the river. He could see the smoke still rising from the morning's disaster. He knew that the German machine guns were still there. He knew the mines were still there. He knew that nothing had changed except that his men were now fewer and more tired. He pleaded with his superiors. He said, "General, this is murder. You are asking me to send these boys to be slaughtered. It is a mathematical impossibility to cross that river." But the order stood. The logic of General Mark Clark was cold and unyielding. He believed that the Germans must be exhausted too. He believed that one more push, one more sacrifice would break the line. He was looking at his map again. He was measuring the distance to Rome. He was not measuring the cost in blood. The word filtered down to the foxholes. The sergeants moved among the men. These were the men of the Texas National Guard. Many of them had grown up together. They were cousins, brothers, and schoolmates from small towns like Waco and Austin. When they heard the order, they didn't scream. They didn't run. They simply looked at each other with a kind of hollow disbelief. They checked their rifles. They tightened their helmet straps. They wrote final notes on scraps of paper and shoved them into their pockets. They knew they were walking into a trap. But they were soldiers, and soldiers obey. At 4:30, the artillery barrage began. It was supposed to suppress the German guns. It was supposed to create a curtain of smoke to hide the crossing. But the wind was cruel that day. It whipped down the valley and blew the smoke screen away in seconds, leaving the river naked and exposed. The whistle blew. "Get up. Let's go." Thousands of men rose from the mud and began to run toward the river. If the first night was a tragedy, the second wave was a massacre. The Germans on the far bank could not believe their eyes. They watched the Americans coming across the flat open ground in broad daylight. The German commander of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division later wrote that he was astonished. He thought the Americans must be insane. He waited. He let them get close. He let them reach the water's edge where the mud was deepest. And then he gave the signal. The air turned into solid lead. The volume of fire was so intense that it sounded like canvas ripping. The MG-42 machine guns fired so fast that the individual shots blurred into a single continuous roar. The first line of American soldiers simply evaporated. They were cut down before they could even touch the boats. Those behind them stepped over the bodies of their friends and kept going. They grabbed the heavy rubber boats and slid them into the water. But the river was waiting. The Rapido was still swollen, still freezing, and still deadly. As the boats drifted into the current, the German mortars began to fall. These were not random shots. The German mortar crews had spent the whole day calculating the exact range. They dropped their shells right into the boats. The river turned red. It is a phrase often used in war stories, but at the Rapido River it was literally true. The concentration of death was so high that the gray water turned a dark crimson. One survivor, Private Bill Carter, later recalled the sound. He said it wasn't just the guns. It was the sound of the bullets hitting the meat. It was a thudding sound. And the screaming. I have never heard men scream like that. On the far bank, the few survivors from the first night who had been trapped in their foxholes all day watched the reinforcements coming. They waved their arms. They screamed, "Go back! Don't come over here! It's a trap!" But their voices were drowned out by the explosions. The fresh troops landed on the German side and jumped into the mud. But there was nowhere to go. The mines were everywhere. If a man crawled forward, he hit a tripwire. If he stayed still, the mortars found him. The chaos was absolute. Officers were killed within minutes of landing, leaving privates to lead the squads. Radios were destroyed. The bridges that the engineers tried to build were blown to matchsticks again. And then something strange happened. The German machine gunners who had been firing nonstop for hours began to slow down. It was not because they were running out of ammunition. It was because they were sickened by what they were doing. A German corporal later captured told his interrogators, "We stopped firing because it was too much. It wasn't war anymore. It was murder. We felt sick looking at the piles of bodies. We couldn't understand why your generals kept sending them. But the American generals did keep sending them." Until long after dark, the attacks continued. Small groups of men trying to find a way through the wire, trying to find a gap in the wall of fire. But there were no gaps. The Gustav line held firm. By midnight, the energy of the assault finally burned itself out. Not because the order was rescinded, but because there was no one left to attack. The regiments had been gutted. The battalions had been reduced to the size of companies. The companies were the size of squads. Silence slowly returned to the Rapido River. It was a heavy, wet silence broken only by the groans of the dying who lay out on the mud flats. The fog rolled back in, covering the dead like a shroud. General Fred Walker sat in his command post. He sat with his head in his hands. He listened to the reports coming in over the wire. Company A, no contact. Company B, wiped out. Company C, 3 survivors. The 36th Infantry Division, the pride of Texas, had virtually ceased to exist as a fighting force. In 48 hours of combat, they had suffered terrible losses. The exact numbers were hard to calculate because so many bodies were washed downstream or buried in the mud. But the estimates were staggering. 1,681 men killed, wounded, or missing in 2 days. If you include the supporting units and the fighting on the flanks, the number rises to over 2,000. And for what? Not a single inch of ground had been gained. The German line was unbroken. The river was not crossed. The road to Rome was still closed. The Fifth Army had spent the lives of 2,000 men to test a theory on a map. Down at the river's edge, a young medic searched the reeds for survivors. He found a soldier sitting in the mud holding his intestines in his hands. The soldier looked up at the medic and asked a simple question. Why? The medic didn't have an answer. General Mark Clark didn't have an answer either. Or perhaps he did, but he wasn't willing to say it. Because to answer that question, he would have to admit that he was wrong. He would have to admit that his ambition had blinded him to reality. As the sun rose on January 22nd, the Battle of the Rapido River was over. The river continued to flow cold and fast, washing away the evidence of the massacre. But the story was not over. Because the men who survived, the angry Texans who had watched their brothers die for nothing, were not going to let this go. They were going to do something that no group of soldiers had ever done before. They were going to declare war on their own general. The guns had stopped firing, but the battle for the truth was just beginning. January 23, 1944. The guns had finally fallen silent along the Rapido River. The smoke drifted away, revealing the scars on the land and the bodies of the dead. But in the headquarters of the Fifth Army, another kind of battle was beginning. The battle for the narrative. Lieutenant General Mark Clark had a problem. He had ordered a frontal assault that his subordinates had warned him against. He had ignored intelligence. He had persisted with a second attack after the first one failed. And the result was a catastrophe. In the military world, a disaster of this magnitude usually requires an investigation. It requires answers. But Mark Clark was a man who knew how to protect his image. He knew that if the truth about the Rapido River got out, if the public learned that he had sent men to die because he misread a map and ignored his officers, his career would be over. He would never take Rome. He would never get his parade. So he did what ambitious men often do. He found a scapegoat. He pointed the finger directly at Major General Fred Walker. Clark claimed that the 36th Division had failed not because the plan was impossible but because the leadership was weak. He repeated the lie that the soldiers had lacked aggression. He claimed that Walker was too old, too cautious, and too soft to lead men in modern war. It was a breathtaking act of betrayal. Walker had been the one trying to save his men. Clark had been the one sending them to their deaths. But Clark had the power. Within weeks, General Walker was relieved of his command. He was sent back to the United States to a training post far away from the front lines. His career as a combat commander was over. Clark also moved to bury the story. The disaster at the Rapido was downplayed in the official reports. It was described as a necessary diversion to draw German troops away from other fronts. The casualties were glossed over. The utter futility of the attack was erased from the headlines. Mark Clark moved on. He turned his eyes back to Rome. 5 months later, in June 1944, Clark finally got his wish. He captured Rome. He rode through the streets in an open jeep waving to the cheering crowds. The photographers were there to capture every moment. He was hailed as a conqueror, the liberator of Rome. But there were men in that army who did not cheer. The survivors of the 36th Division marched into Rome with their heads down. They looked at their general preening for the cameras and they felt a cold, hard hatred. They remembered the mud. They remembered the river. They remembered the friends they had left behind in the water. They made a silent vow. They promised that one day when the war was over they would make Mark Clark pay. Took 2 years. In 1946, the war ended. The Teapatchers went home to Texas. They returned to their farms and their ranches. But they did not forget. The 36th Division Association held a reunion in Brownwood, Texas. Usually these reunions are for drinking beer and telling war stories. But this one was different. This one was a war council. The veterans drafted a resolution. It was a document seething with anger. They petitioned the Congress of the United States to investigate General Mark Clark. They accused him of military incompetence. They accused him of squandering American lives to feed his own ego. This was unprecedented. In the history of the United States, Army soldiers had never tried to court-martial their own victorious general after a war was won. It simply didn't happen. But the Texans were furious. They demanded that Clark be banned from ever holding command again. The story exploded in the press. The Rapido River controversy finally came into the light. The families of the dead finally heard the truth about how their sons had died. Congress agreed to hold hearings. Mark Clark was forced to defend himself. He stood before the committees just as he had stood before his maps. He was smooth. He was articulate. He defended his decisions. He claimed that the attack was necessary to save the landing at Anzio. He claimed it was all part of the big picture. The Army establishment circled the wagons. General George Marshall and General Eisenhower defended Clark. They argued that a commander cannot be judged by a single battle. They argued that in war mistakes are made. Ultimately, the system protected its own. Congress concluded that while the attack was indeed a disaster and a colossal error, it did not amount to a crime. Mark Clark was exonerated. He kept his rank. He kept his medals. But the verdict of history is not written by committees. It is written by the memory of the living. Mark Clark went on to have a long career, but he lived the rest of his life under a shadow. To the world, he was a hero, but to the men of Texas, he was a pariah. For decades, whenever Mark Clark's name was mentioned in a VFW hall in Texas, the room would go silent. Men would spit on the ground. They placed a curse on his memory, a curse born of the freezing water and the red mud of the Rapido. Today, if you go to the site of the battle in Italy, the river looks peaceful. The Rapido flows quietly through the green fields. The mud is gone, but there is a monument there. It lists the names of the men who died in those 48 hours. Thousands of names. And if you look at the military maps from 1944, you can still see the blue line that caused it all. The tragedy of the Rapido River teaches us a terrifying lesson about war. It teaches us that the distance between a general and his soldiers is not measured in miles. It is measured in truth. General Mark Clark looked at a map and saw a symbol. He saw a blue line that was just an obstacle to his ambition. General Fred Walker and his men looked at the ground and saw reality. They saw a torrent that would drown them and a wall of fire that would burn them. The general won the argument because he had the stars on his shoulder. But the soldiers paid the price. Mark Clark got his glory. He got his place in history. But he is remembered not for the city he conquered but for the river where he failed. He is remembered as the man who spent 5,000 American lives like pocket change to buy a ticket to Rome. The map was wrong. The order was wrong. But the dead were real. And their silence speaks louder than any general's defense. This was the Battle of the Rapido. The battle that should never have happened. The one map error that broke the heart of the U.S. Army.